Section 20 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cheryl Martin. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 2, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 20, The Dream Woman, Part 4, by Wilkie Collins. The Third Narrative. The story continued by Percy Fairbank. We took leave of Francis Raven at the door of Farley Hall, with the understanding that he might expect to hear from us again. The same night Mrs. Fairbank and I had a discussion in the sanctuary of our own room. The topic was the hostler story, and the question in dispute between us turned on the measure of charitable duty that we owed to the hostler himself. The view I took of the man's narrative was of the purely matter-of-fact kind. Francis Raven had, in my opinion, brooded over the misty connection between his strange dream and his vile wife until his mind was in a state of partial delusion on that subject. I was quite willing to help him with a trifle of money, and to recommend him to the kindness of my lawyer if he was really in any danger and wanted advice. There my idea of my duty toward this afflicted person began and ended. Confronted with this sensible view of the matter, Mrs. Fairbank's romantic temperament rushed, as usual, into extremes. "I should no more think of losing sight of Francis Raven when his next birthday comes round," says my wife, "than I should think of laying down a good story with the last chapters unread. I am positively determined, Percy, to take him back with us when we return to France, in the capacity of groom. What does one man more or less among the horses matter to people as rich as we are?" In this strain the partner of my joys and sorrows ran on, perfectly impenetrable to everything that I could say on the side of common sense. Need I tell my married brethren how it ended? Of course I allowed my wife to irritate me, and spoke to her sharply. Of course my wife turned her face away indignantly on the conjugal pillow and burst into tears. Of course upon that Mr. made his excuses, and Mrs. had her own way. Before the week was out, we rode over to Underbridge, and duly offered to Francis Raven a place in our service as supernumerary groom. At first the poor fellow seemed hardly able to realize his own extraordinary good fortune. Recovering himself, he expressed his gratitude modestly and becomingly. Mrs. Fairbank's ready sympathies overflowed, as usual, at her lips. She talked to him about our home in France, as if the worn, grey-headed hostler had been a child. "Such a dear old house, Francis, and such pretty gardens. Stables 10 times as big as your stables here. Quite a choice of rooms for you. You must learn the name of our house, Maison Rouge. Our nearest town is Metz. We are within a walk of the beautiful river Moselle, and when we want a change, we have only to take the railway to the frontier and find ourselves in Germany." Listening so far with a very bewildered face, Francis started and changed color when my wife reached the end of her last sentence. "Germany?" he repeated. "Yes. Does Germany remind you of anything?" The hostler's eyes looked down sadly on the ground. "Germany reminds me of my wife," he replied. "Indeed? How?" "She once told me she had lived in Germany, long before I knew her, in the time when she was a young girl." "Was she living with relations or friends?" "She was living as a governess in a foreign family." "In what part of Germany?" "I don't remember, ma'am. I doubt if she told me." "Did she tell you the name of the family?" "Yes, ma'am. It was a foreign name, and it has slipped my memory long since. The head of the family was a wine-grower in a large way of business. I remember that." "Did you hear what sort of wine he grew? There are wine-growers in our neighborhood. Was it Moselle wine?" "I couldn't say, ma'am. I doubt if I ever heard." There the conversation dropped. we engaged to communicate with Francis Raven before we left England, and took our leave. I had made arrangements to pay our round of visits to English friends, and to return to Maison Rouge in the summer. On the eve of departure, certain difficulties in connection with the management of some landed property of mine in Ireland obliged us to alter our plans. Instead of getting back to our house in France in the summer, we only returned a week or two before Christmas. Francis Raven accompanied us, and was duly established, in the nominal capacity of stable-keeper, among the servants at Maison Rouge. Before long, some of the objections to taking him into our employment, which I had foreseen and had vainly mentioned to my wife, forced themselves on our attention in no very agreeable form. Francis Raven failed, as I had feared he would, to get on smoothly with his fellow servants. They were all French, and not one of them understood English. Francis, on his side, was equally ignorant of French. His reserved manners, his melancholy temperament, his solitary ways, all told against him. Our servants called him the English Bear. He grew widely known in the neighborhood under his nickname. Quarrels took place, ending once or twice in blows. It became plain, even to Mrs. Fairbank herself, that some wise change must be made. While we were still considering what the change was to be, the unfortunate hostler was thrown on our hands for some time to come by an accident in the stables. Still pursued by his proverbial ill luck, the poor wretch's leg was broken by a kick from a horse. He was attended to by our own surgeon, in his comfortable bedroom at the stables. As the date of his birthday drew near, he was still confined to his bed. Physically speaking, he was doing very well. Morally speaking, the surgeon was not satisfied. Francis Raven was suffering under some mysterious mental disturbance, which interfered seriously with his rest at night. Hearing this, I thought it my duty to tell the medical attendant what was preying on the patient's mind. As a practical man, he shared my opinion that the hostler was in a state of delusion on the subject of his wife and his dream. Curable delusion, in my opinion, the surgeon added, if the experiment could be fairly tried. How can it be tried? I asked. Instead of replying, the surgeon put a question to me, on his side. Do you happen to know, he said, that this year is leap year? Mrs. Fairbank reminded me of it yesterday, I answered. Otherwise I might not have known it. Do you think Francis Raven knows that this year is leap year? I began to see dimly what my friend was driving at. It depends, I answered, on whether he has got an English almanac. Suppose he has not got the almanac. What then? In that case, pursued the surgeon, Francis Raven is innocent of all suspicion that there is a 29th day in February this year. As a necessary consequence, what will he do? He will anticipate the appearance of the woman with the knife at 2 a.m. of the 29th of February instead of the 1st of March. Let him suffer all his superstitious terrors on the wrong day. Leave him, on the day that is really his birthday, to pass a perfectly quiet night, and to be as sound asleep as other people at 2 a.m. And then, when he wakes comfortably in time for his breakfast, shame him out of his delusion by telling him the truth. I agreed to try the experiment. Leaving the surgeon to caution Mrs. Fairbank on the subject of leap year, I went to the stables to see Mr. Raven. The poor fellow was full of forebodings of the fate in store for him on the ominous 1st of March. He eagerly entreated me to order one of the men-servants to sit up with him on the birthday morning. In granting his request, I asked him to tell me on which day of the week his birthday fell. He reckoned the days on his fingers, and proved his innocence of all suspicion that it was leap year by fixing on the 29th of February, in the full persuasion that it was the 1st of March. Pledged to try the surgeon's experiment, I left his error uncorrected, of course. In so doing, I took my first step blindfold toward the last act in the drama of the hostler's dream. The next day brought with it a little domestic difficulty, which indirectly and strangely associated itself with the coming end. My wife received a letter inviting us to assist in celebrating the silver wedding of two worthy German neighbors of ours, Mr. and Mrs. Beldheimer. Mr. Beldheimer was a large wine grower on the banks of the Moselle. His house was situated on the frontier line of France and Germany, and the distance from our house was sufficiently considerable to make it necessary for us to sleep under our host's roof. Under these circumstances, if we accepted the invitation, a comparison of dates showed that we should be away from home on the morning of the 1st of March. Mrs. Fairbank, holding to her absurd resolution to see with her own eyes what might, or might not, happen to Francis Raven on his birthday, flatly declined to leave Maison Rouge. "It's easy to send an excuse," she said in her offhand manner. I failed, for my part, to see any easy way out of the difficulty. The celebration of a silver wedding in Germany is the celebration of 25 years of happy married life, and the host's claim upon the consideration of his friends on such an occasion is something in the nature of a royal command. After considerable discussion, finding my wife's obstinacy invincible, and feeling that the absence of both of us from the festival would certainly offend our friends, I left Mrs. Fairbank to make her excuses for herself, and directed her to accept the invitation so far as I was concerned. In so doing, I took my second step, blindfold, toward the last act in the drama of the hostler's dream. A week elapsed. The last days of February were at hand. Another domestic difficulty happened, and again this event also proved to be strangely associated with the coming end. My head groom at the stables was one Joseph Rigobert. He was an ill-conditioned fellow, inordinately vain of his personal appearance, and by no means scrupulous in his conduct with women. His one virtue consisted of his fondness for horses, and in the care he took of the animals under his charge. In a word, he was too good a groom to be easily replaced, or he would have quitted my service long since. On the occasion of which I am now writing, he was reported to me by my steward as growing idle and disorderly in his habits. The principal offense alleged against him was, that he had been seen that day in the city of Metz, in the company of a woman, supposed to be an English woman, whom he was entertaining at a tavern when he ought to have been on his way back to Maison Rouge. The man's defense was that the lady, as he called her, was an English stranger, unacquainted with the ways of the place, and that he had only shown her where she could obtain some refreshments at her own request. I administered the necessary reprimand, without troubling myself to inquire further into the matter. In failing to do so, I took my third step, blindfold, toward the last act in the drama of the hostler's dream. Joseph Rigobert immediately volunteered for the duty, as a means, no doubt, of winning his way back to my favor. I accepted his proposal. That day the surgeon dined with us. Toward midnight he and I left the smoky room, and repaired to Francis Raven's bedside. Rigobert was at his post, with no very agreeable expression on his face. The Frenchman and the Englishman had evidently not got on well together so far. Francis Raven lay helpless on his bed, waiting silently for 2 a.m. and the dream woman. "I have come, Francis, to bid you good night," I said cheerfully. "Tomorrow morning I shall look in at breakfast time, before I leave home on a journey." "Thank you for all your kindness, sir. You will not see me alive tomorrow morning. She will find me this time. Mark my words. She will find me this time." "My good fellow, she couldn't find you in England. How in the world is she to find you in France?" "It's borne in on my mind, sir, that she will find me here. At 2 a.m, on my birthday, I shall see her again, and see her for the last time." "Do you mean that she will kill you?" "I mean that, sir, she will kill me, with the knife." "And with Rigobert in the room to protect you?" "I am a doomed man. 50 Rigoberts couldn't protect me." "And you wanted somebody to sit up with you?" "Mere weakness, sir. I don't like to be left alone on my deathbed." I looked at the surgeon. If he had encouraged me, I should certainly, out of sheer compassion, have confessed to Francis Raven the trick that we were playing him. The surgeon held to his experiment. The surgeon's face plainly said, "No." The next day, the 29th of February, was the day of the silver wedding. The first thing in the morning I went to Francis Raven's room. Rigobert met me at the door. "How has he passed the night?" I asked. "Saying his prayers and looking for ghosts," Rigobert answered. "A lunatic asylum is the only proper place for him." I approached the bedside. "Well, Francis, here you are, safe and sound, in spite of what you said to me last night." His eyes rested on mine with a vacant, wondering look. "I don't understand it," he said. "Did you see anything of your wife when the clock struck 2? "No, sir." "Did anything happen?" "Nothing happened, sir." "Doesn't this satisfy you that you were wrong?" His eyes still kept their vacant, wondering look. He only repeated the words he had spoken already. "I don't understand it." I made a last attempt to cheer him. "Come, come, Francis, keep a good heart. You'll be out of bed in a fortnight." He shook his head on the pillow. "There's something wrong," he said. "I don't expect you to believe me, sir. I only say there's something wrong, and time will show it." I left the room. Half an hour later I started for Mr. Beldheimer's house, leaving the arrangements for the morning of the 1st of March in the hands of the doctor and my wife. The one thing which principally struck me when I joined the guests at the silver wedding is also the one thing which it is necessary to mention here. On this joyful occasion, a noticeable lady present was out of spirits. That lady was no other than the heroine of the festival, the mistress of the house. In the course of the evening, I spoke to Mr. Beldheimer's eldest son on the subject of his mother. As an old friend of the family, I had a claim on his confidence, which the young man willingly recognized. "We have had a very disagreeable matter to deal with," he said, "and my mother has not recovered the painful impression left on her mind. Many years since, when my sisters were children, we had an English governess in the house. She left us, as we then understood, to be married. We heard no more of her until a week or 10 days since, when my mother received a letter, in which our ex-governess described herself as being in a condition of great poverty and distress. After much hesitation, she had ventured, at the suggestion of a lady who had been kind to her, to write to her former employers and to appeal to their remembrance of old times. You know my mother. She is not only the most kind-hearted, but the most innocent of women. It is impossible to persuade her of the wickedness that there is in the world. She replied by return of post, inviting the governess to come here and see her, and enclosing the money for her traveling expenses. When my father came home and heard what had been done, he wrote at once to his agent in London to make inquiries, enclosing the address on the governess' letter. Before he could receive the agent's reply, the governess arrived. She produced the worst possible impression on his mind. The agent's letter, arriving a few days later, confirmed his suspicions. Since we had lost sight of her, the woman had led a most disreputable life. My father spoke to her privately. He offered, on condition of her leaving the house, a sum of money to take her back to England. If she refused, the alternative would be an appeal to the authorities and a public scandal. She accepted the money, and left the house. On her way back to England, she appears to have stopped at Metz. You will understand what sort of woman she is when I tell you that she was seen the other day in a tavern with your handsome groom, Joseph Rigobert. While my informant was relating these circumstances, my memory was at work. I recalled what Francis Raven had vaguely told us of his wife's experience in former days as governess in a German family. A suspicion of the truth suddenly flashed across my mind. "What was the woman's name?" I asked. Mr. Beldheimer's son answered, "Alicia Warlock." I had but one idea when I heard that reply: to get back to my house without a moment's needless delay. It was then 10 o'clock at night. The last train to Metz had left long since. I arranged with my young friend, after duly informing him of the circumstances, that I should go by the first train in the morning, instead of staying to breakfast with the other guests who slept in the house. At intervals during the night I wondered uneasily how things were going on at Maison Rouge. Again and again the same question occurred to me on my journey home in the morning of the 1st of March. As the event proved, but one person in my house knew what really happened at the stables on Francis Raven's birthday. Let Joseph Rigobert take my place as narrator, and tell the story of the end to you, as he told it in times past, to his lawyer and to me. Fourth and last narrative. Statement of Joseph Rigobert, addressed to the advocate who defended him at his trial. Respected Sir, on the 27th of February I was sent, on business connected with the stables at Maison Rouge, to the city of Metz. On the public promenade I met a magnificent woman. Complexion blonde. Nationality English. We mutually admired each other. We fell into conversation. She spoke French perfectly, with the English accent. I offered refreshment. My proposal was accepted. We had a long and interesting interview. We discovered that we were made for each other. So far, who is to blame? Is it my fault that I am a handsome man, universally agreeable as such to the fair sex? Is it a criminal offense to be accessible to the amiable weakness of love? I ask again, who is to blame? Clearly, nature. Not the beautiful lady. Not my humble self. To resume. The most hard-hearted person living will understand that two beings made for each other could not possibly part without an appointment to meet again. I made arrangements for the accommodation of the lady in the village near Maison Rouge. She consented to honor me with her company at supper, in my apartment at the stables, on the night of the 29th. The time fixed on was the time when the other servants were accustomed to retire, 11 o'clock. Among the grooms attached to the stables was an Englishman, laid up with a broken leg. His name was Francis. His manners were repulsive. He was ignorant of the French language. In the kitchen he went by the nickname of the English Bear. Strange to say, he was a great favorite with my master and my mistress. They even humored certain superstitious terrors to which this repulsive person was subject. Terrors into the nature of which I, as an advanced free-thinker, never thought it worth my while to inquire. On the evening of the 28th, the Englishman, being a prey to the terrors which I have mentioned, requested that one of his fellow servants might sit up with him for that night only. The wish that he expressed was backed by Mr. Fairbank's authority. Having already incurred my master's displeasure, in what way a proper sense of my own dignity forbids me to relate, I volunteered to watch by the bedside of the English Bear. My object was to satisfy Mr. Fairbank that I bore no malice, on my side, after what had occurred between us. The wretched Englishman passed a night of delirium. Not understanding his barbarous language, I could only gather from his gesture that he was in deadly fear of some fancied apparition at his bedside. From time to time, when this madman disturbed my slumbers, I quieted him by swearing at him. This is the shortest and best way of dealing with persons in his condition. On the morning of the 29th, Mr. Fairbank left us on a journey. Later in the day, to my unspeakable disgust, I found that I had not done with the Englishman yet. In Mr. Fairbank's absence, Mrs. Fairbank took an incomprehensible interest in the question of my delirious fellow-servant's repose at night. Again, one or the other of us was to watch at his bedside and report it if anything happened. Expecting my fair friend to supper, it was necessary to make sure that the other servants at the stables would be safe in their beds that night. Accordingly, I volunteered once more to be the man who kept watch. Mrs. Fairbank complimented me on my humanity. I possess great command over my feelings. I accepted the compliment without a blush. Twice, after nightfall, my mistress and the doctor, the last staying in the house in Mr. Fairbank's absence, came to make inquiries. once before the arrival of my fair friend, and once after. On the second occasion, my apartment being next door to the Englishman's, I was obliged to hide my charming guest in the harness room. She consented with angelic resignation to immolate her dignity to the servile necessities of my position. A more amiable woman, so far, I never met with. After the second visit I was left free. It was then close on midnight. Up to that time there was nothing in the behavior of the mad Englishman to reward Mrs. Fairbank and the doctor for presenting themselves at his bedside. He lay half awake, half asleep, with an odd, wondering kind of look in his face. My mistress at parting warned me to be particularly watchful of him toward 2 a.m. The doctor, in case anything happened, left me a large handbell to ring, which could easily be heard at the house. Restored to the society of my fair friend, I spread the supper table. A pâté, a sausage, and a few bottles of generous Moselle wine composed our simple meal. When persons adore each other, the intoxicating illusion of love transforms the simplest meal into a banquet. With immeasurable capacities for enjoyment, we sat down to table. At the very moment when I placed my fascinating companion in a chair, the infamous Englishman in the next room took that occasion, of all others, to become restless and noisy once more. He struck with his stick on the floor. He cried out in a delirious access of terror, "Rigobert! Rigobert!" The sound of that lamentable voice suddenly assailing our ears terrified my fair friend. She lost all her charming color in an instant. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. "Who is that in the next room?" "A mad Englishman." "An Englishman?" "Compose yourself, my angel. I will quiet him." The lamentable voice called out on me again, "Rigobert! Rigobert!" My fair friend caught me by the arm. "Who is he?" she cried. "What is his name?" Something in her face struck me as she put that question. A spasm of jealousy shook me to the soul. "You know him?" I said. "His name!" she vehemently repeated. "His name!" "Francis," I answered. "Francis what?" I shrugged my shoulders. I could neither remember nor pronounce the barbarous English surname. I could only tell her it began with an R. She dropped back into the chair. Was she going to faint? No, she recovered, and more than recovered, her lost color. Her eyes flashed superbly. What did it mean? Profoundly as I understand women in general, I was puzzled by this woman. "You know him?" I repeated. She laughed at me. "What nonsense! How should I know him? Go and quiet the wretch." My looking-glass was near. One glance at it satisfied me that no woman in her senses could prefer the Englishman to me. I recovered my self-respect. I hastened to the Englishman's bedside. The moment I appeared, he pointed eagerly toward my room. He overwhelmed me with a torrent of words in his own language. I made out, from his gestures and his looks, that he had, in some incomprehensible manner, discovered the presence of my guest, and, stranger still, that he was scared by the idea of a person in my room. I endeavored to compose him on the system which I have already mentioned. That is to say, I swore at him in my language. The result not proving satisfactory, I own I shook my fist in his face and left the bedchamber. Returning to my fair friend, I found her walking backward and forward in a state of excitement wonderful to behold. She had not waited for me to fill her glass. She had begun the generous Moselle in my absence. I prevailed on her with difficulty to place herself at the table. Nothing would induce her to eat. "My appetite is gone," she said. "Give me wine." The generous Moselle deserves its name. Delicate on the palate, with prodigious body. The strength of this fine wine produced no stupefying effect on my remarkable guest. It appeared to strengthen and exhilarate her, nothing more. She always spoke in the same low tone, and always, turn the conversation as I might, brought it back with the same dexterity to the subject of the Englishman in the next room. In any other woman, this persistency would have offended me. My lovely guest was irresistible. I answered her questions with the docility of a child. She possessed all the amusing eccentricity of her nation. When I told her of the accident which confined the Englishman to his bed, she sprang to her feet. An extraordinary smile irradiated her countenance. She said, "Show me the horse who broke the Englishman's leg. I must see that horse." I took her to the stables. She kissed the horse. On my word of honor, she kissed the horse. That struck me. I said, "You do know the man, and he has wronged you in some way." No, she would not admit it, even then. "I kiss all beautiful animals," she said. "Haven't I kissed you?" With that charming explanation of her conduct, she ran back up the stairs. I only remained behind to lock the stable door again. When I rejoined her, I made a startling discovery. I caught her coming out of the Englishman's room. "I was just going downstairs again to call you," she said. "The man in there is getting noisy once more." The mad Englishman's voice assailed our ears once more. "Rigobert! Rigobert!" He was a frightful object to look at when I saw him this time. His eyes were staring wildly. The perspiration was pouring over his face. In a panic of terror he clasped his hands. He pointed up to heaven. By every sign and gesture that a man can make, he entreated me not to leave him again. I really could not help smiling. The idea of my staying with him, and leaving my fair friend by herself in the next room! I turned to the door. When the mad wretch saw me leaving, he burst out into a screech of despair, so shrill that I feared it might awaken the sleeping servants. My presence of mind in emergencies is proverbial among those who know me. I tore open the cupboard in which he kept his linen, seized a handful of his handkerchiefs, gagged him with one of them, and secured his hands with the others. There was now no danger of his alarming the servants. After tying the last knot, I looked up. The door between the Englishman's room and mine was open. My fair friend was standing on the threshold, watching him as he lay helpless on the bed, watching me as I tied the last knot. "What are you doing there?" I asked. "Why did you open the door?" She stepped up to me and whispered her answer in my ear, with her eyes all the time upon the man on the bed. "I heard him scream." "Well?" "I thought you had killed him." I drew back from her in horror. The suspicion of me which her words implied was sufficiently detestable in itself, but her manner when she uttered the words was more revolting still. It so powerfully affected me that I started back from that beautiful creature as I might have recoiled from a reptile crawling over my flesh. Before I had recovered myself sufficiently to reply, my nerves were assailed by another shock. I suddenly heard my mistress's voice calling to me from the stable-yard. There was no time to think. There was only time to act. The one thing needed was to keep Mrs. Fairbank from ascending the stairs and discovering, not my lady guest only, but the Englishman also, gagged and bound on his bed. I instantly hurried to the yard. As I ran down the stairs, I heard the stable clock strike the 1:45 in the morning. My mistress was eager and agitated. The doctor, in attendance on her, was smiling to himself, like a man amused at his own thoughts. "Is Francis awake or asleep?" Mrs. Fairbank inquired. "He has been a little restless, madam, but he is now quiet again. If he is not disturbed," I added those words to prevent her from ascending the stairs, "he will soon fall off into a quiet sleep." "Has nothing happened since I was here last?" "Nothing, madam." The doctor lifted his eyebrows with a comical look of distress. "Alas, alas, Mrs. Fairbank," he said, "nothing has happened. The days of romance are over." "It is not 2:00 yet," my mistress answered, a little irritably. The smell of the stables was strong on the morning air. She put her handkerchief to her nose and led the way out of the yard by the north entrance, the entrance communicating with the gardens and the house. I was ordered to follow her, along with the doctor. Once out of the smell of the stables, she began to question me again. She was unwilling to believe that nothing had occurred in her absence. I invented the best answers I could think of on the spur of the moment, and the doctor stood by laughing. So the minutes passed till the clock struck 2. Upon that, Mrs. Fairbank announced her intention of personally visiting the Englishman in his room. To my great relief, the doctor interfered to stop her from doing this. "You have heard that Francis is just falling asleep," he said. "If you enter his room, you may disturb him. It is essential to the success of my experiment that he should have a good night's rest, and that he should own it himself, before I tell him the truth. I must request, madam, that you will not disturb the man. Rigobert will ring the alarm bell if anything happens." My mistress was unwilling to yield. For the next 5 minutes, at least, there was a warm discussion between the two. In the end, Mrs. Fairbank was obliged to give way, for the time. "In half an hour," she said, "Francis will either be sound asleep or awake again. In half an hour I shall come back." She took the doctor's arm. They returned together to the house. Left by myself, with half an hour before me, I resolved to take the Englishwoman back to the village, then, returning to the stables, to remove the gag and the bindings from Francis, and to let him screech to his heart's content. What would his alarming the whole establishment matter to me, after I had got rid of the compromising presence of my guest? Returning to the yard, I heard a sound like the creaking of an open door on its hinges. The gate of the north entrance I had just closed with my own hand. I went round to the west entrance, at the back of the stables. It opened on a field crossed by 2 footpaths in Mr. Fairbank's grounds. The nearest footpath led to the village. The other led to the highroad and the river. Arriving at the west entrance, I found the door open, swinging to and fro slowly in the fresh morning breeze. I had myself locked and bolted that door, after admitting my fair friend at 11 o'clock. A vague dread of something wrong stole its way into my mind. I hurried back to the stables. I looked into my own room. It was empty. I went to the harness room. Not a sign of the woman was there. I returned to my room and approached the door of the Englishman's bedchamber. Was it possible that she had remained there during my absence? An unaccountable reluctance to open the door made me hesitate, with my hand on the lock. I listened. There was not a sound inside. I called softly. There was no answer. I drew back a step, still hesitating. I noticed something dark moving slowly in the crevice between the bottom of the door and the boarded floor. Snatching up the candle from the table, I held it low and looked. The dark, slowly moving object was a stream of blood. That horrid sight roused me. I opened the door. The Englishman lay on his bed, alone in the room. He was stabbed in 2 places, in the throat and in the heart. The weapon was left in the second wound. It was a knife of English manufacture, with a handle of buckhorn as good as new. I instantly gave the alarm. Witnesses can speak to what followed. It is monstrous to suppose that I am guilty of the murder. I admit that I am capable of committing follies, but I shrink from the bare idea of a crime. Besides, I had no motive for killing the man. The woman murdered him in my absence. The woman escaped by the west entrance while I was talking to my mistress. I have no more to say. I swear to you what I have here written is a true statement of all that happened on the morning of the 1st of March. Accept, sir, the assurance of my sentiments of profound gratitude and respect. Joseph Rigobert. Last lines added by Percy Fairbank. Tried for the murder of Francis Raven, Joseph Rigobert was found not guilty. The papers of the assassinated man presented ample evidence of the deadly animosity felt toward him by his wife. The investigations pursued on the morning when the crime was committed showed that the murderess, after leaving the stable, had taken the footpath which led to the river. The river was dragged, without result. It remains doubtful to this day whether she died by drowning or not. The one thing certain is, that Alicia Warlock was never seen again. So, beginning in mystery, ending in mystery, the Dream Woman passes from your view. Ghost, demon, or living human creature, say for yourselves which she is, or, knowing what unfathomed wonders are around you, what unfathomed wonders are in you, let the wise words of the greatest of all poets be explanation enough. We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. End of section 20.